Story 1. It was a quiet afternoon, one of those rare moments when time seems to stretch, and the world feels like it's moving in slow motion. The air outside was still, as if holding its breath, the soft hum of life just beneath the surface. I sat by the window, casually scrolling through my phone, when something strange caught my eye. A figure, small and distant, was walking slowly down the street. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, people walk by all the time. But something about this person made me pause, something that tickled the edge of my senses, making me uneasy. They were coming directly toward my house, their steps slow and deliberate, and I felt an odd pull in my chest. As they drew nearer, my eyes instinctively followed them, and I noticed how their gaze was fixed on me. It wasn't just a passing glance, like you might expect from someone simply walking by. No, their eyes were locked onto mine with an intensity that felt off. It wasn't right. I couldn't make out their features from this distance, but there was something about the way they moved, purposeful, unnervingly deliberate, that struck me as wrong. The air around me seemed to thicken, and I found myself rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away. Everything else seemed to fade, leaving only this figure, walking down the street and staring directly at me, as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of us. As they came closer, a sudden rush of recognition hit me. My heart skipped a beat, and a cold chill ran through me, like an icy hand crawling down my spine. I knew this person, but how? Where had I seen them before? Their face was blurry in my memory, like a figure from a dream. Yet, everything about them, the way they stood, the way they walked, felt too familiar. My mind strained to place them, but the more I tried, the more the memory slipped through my fingers, just out of reach. The figure stopped right in front of my house, their gaze still unwavering. My pulse quickened, panic creeping in. There was no mistaking it now, they were staring directly at me, like they were studying me, sizing me up. The knot in my stomach tightened, and an overwhelming sense of dread flooded over me. Why were they standing there? Why hadn't they just moved on like anyone else? I leaned forward slightly, trying to get a clearer view of them, but they didn't move. They stood frozen, as if waiting for something. Waiting for me. My heart was pounding now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't just some passerby. No. This was someone who knew something, something I didn't, something I wasn't ready to understand. Desperate to make sense of it, I glanced over my shoulder, hoping someone might be around to explain what was happening. But the house was silent, empty. I was alone. There was no one to help me. I stood up suddenly, my breath shallow, and decided I had to see for myself. Slowly, I made my way toward the door, the floor creaking beneath my feet with every step. I opened it just enough to peer out, and that's when I saw it. The face. More visible now in the fading light, it made my blood run cold. It was their eyes. The same eyes that had been locked onto mine. But now, there was something else in them. A predatory glint, like a hunter studying its prey. The realization hit me with sickening clarity. The face wasn't just familiar, it was a face I'd seen years ago, only once, but I could never forget it. It had been on a police report I read all those years ago, about a man arrested for a string of break-ins in the neighborhood. His face had been all over the news, but I never thought much of it at the time. Until now. I knew who they were. This was the same person. The one from the report. The one who had been caught. But why were they here? Why were they watching me? Panic gripped me, and I stepped back, heart hammering in my chest. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing in the stillness of my home. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Had he been released from prison? Had I missed something? Why was he here? Why was he watching me? I backed away from the door, my eyes glued to the window. The figure hadn't moved, not even an inch. I couldn't look away. The more I stared, the more it felt like my entire life had been hijacked by this moment, by this stranger standing outside, watching me. A web of fear and confusion tangled my thoughts. What did they want from me? Why were they here? The idea of calling the police seemed absurd. I had no proof, no real reason to believe they were dangerous. All I had was a feeling. A gut instinct, a sense of dread that clawed at me, refusing to let go. My fingers hovered over my phone, but I couldn't bring myself to make the call. What if I was just overreacting? What if this wasn't the same person at all? Just as I was about to dismiss the whole thing, I saw movement from the corner of my eye. My heart stopped. The figure was no longer standing still. They turned, and with the same deliberate slowness, they started walking away. A strange sense of relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. My eyes followed them as they reached the end of the street and stopped once more. They turned, glancing over their shoulder, locking eyes with me for one final time. That moment, eternal, suffocating, felt like it stretched on forever. My heart pounded, and the fear that had gripped me before flared up once again, raw and sharp. The figure then disappeared into the darkness, their form vanishing into the night. The only trace of them left was a faint, lingering chill in the air, a sense of their presence still hanging in the atmosphere. I stood frozen, my mind reeling, unsure of what to do next. Had it really been them? Was I imagining things? The unease still gnawed at me, a constant weight pressing on my chest. That feeling of recognition, the certainty that I knew them from somewhere deep in my past, it wouldn't fade. And I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't over. That I hadn't seen the last of that stranger. Something dark was connected to them. Something I wasn't ready to confront. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I ever would be. Story 2. It was one of those quiet nights, the kind where the world outside seems to vanish, leaving only the soft, rhythmic sound of my own breathing in the air. The house was still, almost too still, as I sank into the couch, exhausted from the weight of a long day. I just wanted to unwind, to let the tension in my body melt away. But as I started to settle in, something caught my ear. A soft creak. It was faint, like someone walking across the floor upstairs. My heart skipped a beat, the kind of jolt that sends a cold rush through your veins. I froze, my mind spinning. I was alone in the house, or so I thought. Everyone else was either in their rooms or out for the day. I hesitated, wondering if the house was simply settling, but something in my gut told me it was more than that. Slowly, I stood, my feet heavy against the floor as I made my way toward the stairs. The sound had stopped, but as I reached the base of the staircase, it came again. This time, it was clearer, unmistakable, footsteps, soft but deliberate, echoing through the hallway above me. A chill crawled up my spine, and I stood frozen, straining to listen. No one was supposed to be upstairs. I had just checked not long ago. But there they were, the footsteps, moving steadily, as if someone was walking just beyond my reach. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and slowly ascended the stairs. The old wood creaked under my weight, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. The hallway above was dimly lit, shadows stretching long and menacing beneath the crack of light spilling from the doorways. I reached the first bedroom and called out, "Hello." My voice felt too small, too fragile in the silence. No answer. I opened the door. The room was just as it should be. The bed neatly made, the room untouched. A twinge of confusion twisted in my gut as I moved on to the next room, and the next. Each door creaked open, revealing rooms that were dark but undisturbed. Closets checked, nothing. It was as though the entire upstairs was holding its breath, waiting. I moved back down the stairs, my mind racing. Was it my imagination? Had I been hearing things? I sank back into the couch, trying to calm myself, but the unease that gripped me wouldn't let go. The feeling of those footsteps, their very real, deliberate sound, kept replaying in my mind, growing louder with each passing minute. I tried to distract myself, but every little noise in the house made me jump. The house was alive, it seemed, each creak and groan only adding to my growing dread. Around midnight, it came again. Louder this time. The footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. Someone was walking, but no one was there. My stomach churned, knotting in a way that made my breath catch in my throat. I shot up from the couch, heart racing. I checked every room again, even the basement, but nothing had changed. The house remained just as it had been before, empty. Yet the air had thickened, heavy with something I couldn't place, something unseen. The silence was suffocating. I grabbed my phone, desperate to talk to someone, anyone. I needed reassurance. But when I called my closest friend, the screen flickered and showed no service. I stared at it, bewildered. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a shadow, a flicker of movement at the corner of my eye. I whipped around, but the room was empty. I checked the windows, the doors, all locked, everything in its place. I felt like I was suffocating, drowning in this suffocating silence. I needed to leave. But as I reached the front door, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were coming down the stairs, slow and deliberate. I froze. The door was right there. The outside world was just beyond it. But I couldn't bring myself to open it. The fear paralyzed me. Slowly, I turned around, expecting to see someone at the top of the staircase. But there was no one. The house felt like it was closing in on me. The walls seemed to press in, the air thick and heavy. I checked every room, every corner again, but still, no one was there. The footsteps had stopped. For a moment, everything was eerily calm. But that quiet didn't bring relief. It only deepened the sense that something was wrong. I stayed in the living room, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The house remained still, as if holding its breath. Sleep didn't come. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something unseen was moving around me, just out of sight. The next morning, I checked the house once more. Everything was exactly as I had left it. No signs of a break-in. No evidence of anything disturbed. The house was undisturbed, but I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something had been there. Something had been walking around, just out of view. To this day, I still hear it. The faint sound of footsteps in the hall, the soft creak of the floorboards when I'm alone. I check the house every time, but no one is ever there. And yet, I can't shake the feeling that someone is moving around when I'm not looking. Story 3. It had been one of those long, exhausting days where I couldn't wait to collapse into bed, but I still had to tackle a mountain of emails. I sat at my desk, the glow of the screen cutting through the dim room, and began my usual routine, sorting through the clutter in my inbox, deleting the spam, and moving important messages to their designated folders. It was almost soothing, this small act of control in an otherwise chaotic day. But as I scrolled through, one email caught my attention. It was from my own email address. I paused, confused. At first, I thought it might have been some kind of glitch, maybe an email I'd accidentally sent to myself. But when I clicked it open, a chill ran down my spine. The subject line was simple: one day before you start. My heart skipped a beat. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but it certainly wasn't the unsettling words that filled the screen. The email read, "I know you've been trying to forget. Oh, don't worry, I won't make you remember today. But don't think for a second you're out of my reach. I'll be watching." My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, trying to process what I was reading. There was no way I had written that. The phrasing was strange, the tone chilling, and something about it felt wrong. But it was the timestamp that really made my stomach drop. This email had been sent a full day before I'd even created the account. I stared at the screen, my mind spinning. My email account had been set up a year ago, so how could something come from it before it even existed? I refreshed the page, checked the sender's information again and again. It was my address, no mistakes, no signs of tampering. My hand shook as I reached for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, to ask if they'd sent this as some sick joke. But when I scrolled through my contacts, I realized the truth: no one had access to my account. And none of them could pull off something so twisted. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Could it be a hacked account? Maybe someone had infiltrated my email, sending these cryptic messages from within. But how could they send something to me before I even existed in the system? The possibility was impossible. I tried to tell myself it was just a glitch, that I was overthinking it. Maybe I was just tired, desperate to find any explanation to ease the growing dread gnawing at my insides. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like something was watching me, just beyond my reach, waiting for the moment to strike. Every time I reread that email, it felt more personal. As though it was meant for me and no one else. Trying to distract myself, I clicked through the rest of my emails, searching for something, anything, that might help explain the madness. But when I scrolled through my inbox, I noticed something else. Every single email had a timestamp that didn't make sense. Some were dated earlier than they should have been, days, sometimes even weeks, before I had actually received them. I'd never noticed it before, but now the disjointed dates were impossible to ignore. Panic gripped me, my chest tightening with each passing second. I slammed the laptop shut, my fingers trembling as I tried to steady my breath. I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to leave. I had to get out, away from whatever was happening, whatever was watching. But just as I grabbed my keys, my phone buzzed. I froze. Another message. This one came from an unknown number, its simplicity sending a jolt of fear through me. I'm still here. I didn't hesitate. I turned off my phone and ran, not even caring where I was going. I just needed to escape. The night air felt colder than it should have, and the world around me seemed different. The shadows were deeper, the silence more oppressive. It was as though something had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I was the only one who noticed. Hours later, I returned home. The house felt wrong, like it had been waiting for me. I hesitated at the door, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, making my way straight to my computer. My fingers trembled as I opened my inbox again, hoping to find something, some shred of normalcy. But it was all gone. The strange email from the day before, the one from my own address, was nowhere to be found. Not in my inbox, not in the trash, not in the spam folder. It was as if it had never existed. I let out a breath of relief, but just as I was about to close the window, a new email popped up. From my own address. The subject line made my blood run cold: "You can't escape it." I opened the email, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The message was brief, just 2 words: "I'm waiting." My head spun. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hunting me, something that had been watching me for far longer than I realized. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, it was always there. Waiting. Watching. Waiting for me to make a mistake. And I was starting to wonder, was I losing my mind, or was I finally starting to see the truth? Story 4. I woke up to the eerie howl of the wind slicing through the night, but there was something far more chilling than just the gusts rattling outside. It wasn't the wind that jolted me upright, heart racing, but the icy air that gripped my skin as soon as my eyes fluttered open. I pulled the covers tighter, desperately trying to shield myself from the unnatural cold that seemed to seep into my bones. The warmth of the room, the comfort I'd drifted to sleep in, had vanished. I couldn't make sense of it. I had gone to bed with the windows shut tight, the heat humming softly through the house. How could this have happened? Shivering, I swung my legs out of bed, the cold floor biting through the soles of my feet. The chill in the room was so intense, it felt as if the temperature had plummeted in an instant. My breath fogged in front of me, and every inch of my body screamed for warmth. I staggered down the dark hallway, my arms wrapped around myself as I tried to stave off the freezing air. And when I reached the living room, my confusion only deepened. Every window in the house was wide open, curtains fluttering like ghosts in the wind. The cold rush of air swirled into the room, a sharp, biting reminder that I wasn't alone in this place. I stood frozen in disbelief, my mind scrambling for an explanation. How could this happen? I lived alone. No one else had been here, I was sure of it. I had checked everything before going to bed, every window locked, every door sealed tight. But now, every single window was open. The air seeped in through the cracks, and the temperature continued to drop, as if the very walls of my home were being swallowed by the cold. I quickly moved to each window, closing them one by one. But when I reached the last one, my stomach turned. This window wasn't just open, it had been forced open. Deep, jagged marks marred the frame, like someone had pried it open with relentless force. My heart pounded in my chest, the blood rushing to my ears, drowning out the winds howling. Who had been here? And why hadn't I heard anything? The house was eerily silent, too silent. There were no creaking floorboards, no whispers of movement, nothing to suggest someone had entered. Yet, here I was, standing in the middle of my living room, surrounded by open windows and a bitter chill that clawed at me, mocking my disbelief. I tried to calm my racing thoughts, but the more I lingered on it, the more the unease gnawed at me. No sign of forced entry through the doors, nothing disturbed in the house, no misplaced furniture, no dropped objects. It was as though everything had been left undisturbed, except for the windows. But how could that be? And if someone had opened them, why hadn't I heard anything? Why hadn't I noticed when it happened? I made my way through the rest of the house, checking every window in turn. The kitchen window was open, the bathroom window too, even the small window in the laundry room. Every single window, wide open, as if someone had gone through the house methodically, unlocking them one by one. I couldn't understand it. I checked the locks again. Secure. No signs of a break-in. No signs of anyone being here. Desperate for some semblance of logic, I grabbed my phone and called a friend. My voice shook as I explained what had happened, hoping for a rational explanation to ground me. When my friend answered, their voice was a lifeline, but my words came out ragged, filled with panic. Maybe you just forgot, they suggested, trying to ease my tension. Maybe you opened them yourself and don't remember. But that didn't make sense. I would have noticed the cold. I would have felt the breeze before I drifted to sleep. Something about this felt wrong, deliberate. Whoever, or whatever, had opened those windows had done it with purpose. I walked to the front door and checked again. Locked. The deadbolt secure. There was no sign of anyone coming or going. But then, as I stood there staring at the door, a chill crept down my spine. Something was wrong. The front step was covered in frost, a thin layer of ice that hadn't been there when I went to bed. I stepped outside, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air, my eyes scanning the ground for any clue, any trace. But there were no footprints. No sign that anyone had been out here. The longer I stood there, the heavier the dread weighed on me. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't something I had forgotten to do. Someone had been in the house. But why hadn't I heard a thing? Not a footstep, not a creak of the floorboards, nothing. It was as if whoever had opened those windows had done it without leaving a single trace. I decided to call the police, though I wasn't sure what to even tell them. There was no evidence of a break-in, no signs of forced entry, just cold air, open windows, and the growing sensation that something had been watching me while I slept. When the officer arrived, he took a quick look around. He inspected the windows, checked the front door, and confirmed what I already knew, no sign of forced entry. "Everything seems fine," he said, but there was a hesitation in his voice, an uncertainty that made my stomach churn. "Are you sure the windows were locked when you went to bed?" I nodded, trying to hide the frustration that bubbled inside me. "I'm sure. I check everything before I go to sleep. I don't leave windows open." He sighed, giving me a reassuring smile that only deepened the pit in my chest. "Sometimes things get forgotten. It's not uncommon for people to forget if they opened a window, especially if they're half asleep or in a hurry." I wanted to argue, but there was nothing more I could say. He left, and I was left alone in the house, still chilled to the bone, still haunted by the sensation that something wasn't right. That night, I lay in bed, wide awake. The house was silent, the cold still clinging to the air, but it wasn't the cold that kept me awake, it was the feeling of being watched. The windows were all closed now, but every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, made me feel as though I wasn't alone. My eyes never left the door, the windows, waiting for something, anything, to explain what had happened. But nothing came. The night passed without incident, but the unease never left. When morning came, the house seemed normal again. Everything was locked, everything was secure. Or so it seemed. The windows were closed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, someone, had been in my house. That something had been watching me as I slept. And no matter how many times I checked the locks, no matter how many times I reassured myself that everything was as it should be, I couldn't forget the cold, the open windows, or the oppressive silence that had followed me through the night. Something was out there. And it was waiting. Story 5. I was sitting at my desk, working in the quiet of an early afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft golden hue across the room, its warmth creating an almost serene atmosphere. But that calm was shattered by a sudden knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone, perhaps a delivery or maybe a neighbor in need of something, but when I opened the door, there was nothing. Not a person in sight. Just a small, unmarked package sitting innocently on the porch. I hesitated for a moment, my unease settling like a heavy weight in my chest. No return address. No name. Nothing to indicate where it had come from or who had sent it. Just a plain brown box that looked so ordinary. But in that moment, something in my gut twisted. It didn't feel right. I shook off the instinct to slam the door shut and quickly grabbed the package, closing the door behind me with a soft click. I sat at my kitchen table, my fingers trembling as I peeled away the tape, the sound of it unnervingly loud in the silence. When the package opened, the last thing I expected to find was a photograph. A photo of my house. The very one I was sitting in. I recognized it immediately. The image had been taken from the street, with the front yard, the trees lining the driveway, and the familiar shape of my front door framed in a way that felt all too intimate. But there, stark against the background, was a large, bold red X. It sliced through the photo, slashing across the house like a brutal scar. My blood turned to ice, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. The X seemed to glare back at me, accusing, mocking, as if it knew something I didn't. I stared at it for a long time, my mind racing with possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. Who would send this? Why? And more chillingly, how? Had they been watching me? My every move? Was this some kind of twisted warning? The air in the room felt thicker now, pressing in on me. I checked the package again. Still no return address. No clue as to who was behind this, just an anonymous message, if you could even call it that. I stood up, pacing frantically around the kitchen, trying to calm myself. I was used to feeling safe in my home, but now, it felt like the walls were closing in, the space too small, too suffocating. Was someone out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment? The thought of it made my skin crawl. I had to do something. I had to know what this meant. But what could I do? Call the police over a photo with a red X? It seemed so trivial, so small. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how personal it was. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed my friend's number. When she picked up, I rushed to explain everything, but her response was cold comfort. "It's probably just a prank," she said, "maybe even a mistake." Her voice was calm, logical, as though she were trying to reassure me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something far more sinister. Her words didn't ease the tension gnawing at my insides. After the call, I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was nothing, just a weird, unexplained thing. But my eyes kept drifting back to the photo. The red X seemed to taunt me, to mock my fear. That night, I went outside. I had to check. I had to be sure. I walked around the yard, scanning every corner, every shadow. But there was nothing. Everything seemed normal. Yet, the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being tracked. Followed. And I was powerless to stop it. The next morning, when I woke, the photo was still on the table where I had left it. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Something about it, something deep inside me, said that it was important. A warning, perhaps. A clue. The lines of the red X seemed to grow sharper, the edges almost alive. Like it was beckoning me into something I couldn't escape. That evening, as the darkness crept in, I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself, when there was another knock. My heart lurched, and a cold sweat broke out across my body. The knock echoed through the house, louder this time. I froze, unable to move. My mind raced with the worst possible scenarios. I approached the door slowly, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting some horror to greet me on the other side. But there was nothing. The porch was empty. Or so I thought, until my eyes caught something else. A small package, identical to the first one, lay against the side of the door. My stomach churned. Trembling, I picked it up and brought it inside, my heart pounding in my chest. It felt as though I had crossed a line, like I had just stepped deeper into something far darker than I could comprehend. I tore the package open with shaking hands, the dread inside me clawing its way up my throat. Another photograph. This time, the image was the same, but there was a difference. The red X was still there, but now, creeping along the edge of the yard, was a shadow. A dark shape, barely visible, but unmistakable. It seemed to be moving toward the house, closer, closer, like someone, or something, was coming for me. The shadow was there, waiting, watching. I gasped, my heart pounding in my chest. The photos weren't just warnings anymore. They were following me. They were tracking me, marking my every move. The photos were becoming more detailed. More specific. Whoever was sending them knew everything, and they weren't stopping. Panic gripped me as I realized just how deep this had gone. Someone was watching me. Someone was out there, planning something. But what? And when would it happen? I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to act. I dialed the police, explaining everything I'd found, each strange package, each chilling photo, but a part of me knew they wouldn't be able to help. Whoever was behind this was playing a game, and I was caught in the middle of it, with no way to know what the next move would be. That night, I stayed inside, checking every corner of my house, locking every door, every window. But the fear, the dread, lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. The photos sat on the table, their red excess staring back at me as I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every creak in the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside felt like it was a part of something bigger, something I couldn't escape. The photos were a message. A warning. A glimpse into something dark, something I was too afraid to understand. And I had no idea when the next blow would land or what would happen next. Story 6. It was just past midnight when I first noticed it, something in the corner of my eye, lurking just beyond the reach of my vision. I had been sitting on the couch, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, the faint glow of the TV flickering in the quiet dark of the house. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a steady, comforting noise that should have reassured me. But it didn't. I glanced up from my screen, and for a split second, I thought I saw something in the window to my right. A reflection, I assumed at first, just the light playing tricks on me. But when I looked closer, I realized that the figure standing next to me wasn't mine. It was someone else, too close, right behind me, just inches away. My heart froze in my chest, a cold rush of panic flooding my veins as I stared at the figure. It was still, silent, almost as if it was waiting for me to notice, to acknowledge its presence. The air grew heavy, thick, pressing against my lungs. My breath quickened, sharp and shallow, as I fought the overwhelming urge to turn around. The reflection didn't move, it just lingered, waiting, like a shadow in the corner of my mind. My body was paralyzed, the chill of fear creeping up my spine, sending every hair on the back of my neck standing at attention. I couldn't stay there any longer. I turned around, half expecting to find the room empty, just a trick of the light, just my mind playing cruel games. But when I looked, the room behind me was just as empty as before. The silence in the house pressed down on me, suffocating, like a heavy weight on my chest. I could hear my pulse in my ears, loud and frantic, and for a moment, I was sure I had imagined it all. I looked back at the window. The figure was gone. Gone, but not gone. The doubt gnawed at me. It had to have been a shadow, a trick of the light, right? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I could still feel the presence, like something was lurking just beyond my sight, something I couldn't explain but couldn't shake. The house suddenly felt colder, and a bone-deep unease settled in my gut. The hairs on my neck still didn't lie flat. I sat still, trying to calm the racing thoughts in my mind. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing but a passing hallucination. But the feeling wouldn't leave. It clung to me, creeping through every corner of my thoughts. Had someone been in the room with me? Had I missed it somehow, distracted by the glow of my phone? Or was it all in my head, just exhaustion playing tricks on me? But I knew it wasn't. I hadn't imagined it. The reflection had been too vivid, too real. The figure had been too clear. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay still, I decided to get up. I had to check the rest of the house. I didn't want to, but I couldn't shake the sense that something, or someone, was watching me, waiting. I walked through the darkened halls, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet, each sound amplified in the stillness. The house stretched out before me like a maze of shadows, corners hiding secrets, hallways whispering doubts. I checked the bedrooms. Locked. As they should be. The house seemed empty. Safe. But then, as I passed through the kitchen, something caught my eye, something on the counter. A small, folded piece of paper. I hadn't seen it there earlier. It wasn't mine. It shouldn't have been there. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the paper feeling cold and unfamiliar in my grip. The handwriting on it was neat, almost deliberate, like the person who wrote it had taken their time. The words were simple, chilling, "I've been waiting for you." The words sank into my stomach like a stone, a cold dread spreading through me. I thought back to the reflection, to the figure standing so close behind me, watching me. Had it been trying to communicate with me? The thought twisted my gut into knots. Or was it something worse? Something far darker, something that wasn't human at all. The panic surged, rising in my chest. I checked the locks on every door, the windows, everything was secured, but still, the fear wouldn't fade. It felt like the house itself was closing in, like the walls were watching me. The silence was thick now, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone. That night, I stayed awake, every creak, every whisper of the house making my pulse race. Every time I passed a window or a mirror, I half expected to see that figure again, standing just behind me, watching. The quiet that used to be soothing now felt like a cage, like something was waiting for me to make a mistake. By morning, I convinced myself that it had just been a nightmare, a product of my own fears. But the note on the counter still sat there, and the feeling of being watched refused to leave. I couldn't shake the unease that had taken root in me. I didn't tell anyone about it, not at first. Who would believe me? But deep inside, I knew, I couldn't ignore it. Something was here. Something wasn't supposed to be. Days passed, and I tried to act normal, to ignore the strange feeling that clung to me. But every time I glanced at a reflection, a mirror, a window, I expected to see that figure again, standing just behind me, waiting. But it never came. It never showed itself again, not in the reflections at least. That night, I decided to sleep with the lights on. It felt silly, childish, but I didn't care. I needed to feel safe, to feel like I wasn't alone. But when I woke up in the middle of the night, the lights were off. I hadn't turned them off. I was sure of it. The room was pitch black, the air thick with that suffocating silence. I turned my head, and for a moment, I saw it again, the reflection, but this time it wasn't in the window. I was staring directly into the mirror on the wall. There was someone standing next to me, so close that I could feel their breath on my skin, their presence pressing into my space. But when I turned around, there was no one there. I was alone. Or was I? Story 7. It was a quiet evening, and I was sitting at my desk, mindlessly scrolling through emails, the soft hum of the computer the only sound in the room. But something wasn't right. A small, folded piece of paper sat on the counter, just barely visible from my peripheral vision. At first, I thought it was just another piece of junk mail, or maybe a forgotten note from someone in the house. But the longer I stared at it, the more uneasy I became. It wasn't something I recognized. My heart began to beat a little faster as I walked toward it. I had no idea how it got there, or if anyone else had seen it. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges like it had been lying around for years, and the handwriting on it. It was sharp, precise, but unfamiliar. It was the kind of writing that felt too deliberate, too calculated. It didn't sit right. My hand trembled slightly as I picked it up. The moment I touched it, a chill ran up my spine. I flipped it over, half expecting some cryptic message or a bad joke, but nothing prepared me for what I saw. The words burned themselves into my mind. I know everything about you. The sentence was so simple, but the weight of it hit me like a sudden blow to the chest. My stomach twisted, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I didn't recognize the handwriting. I didn't recognize the paper. There was no return address, no signature, no hint of who could have sent it. I know everything about you. The words echoed in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone I couldn't see, was standing right behind me. I scanned the note again, looking for any clue, any shred of context. There was nothing. No explanation. Just those words, so clear and ominous. I felt a creeping sensation as if something was watching me from the shadows. My breath hitched, and I couldn't help but glance around the room. The air felt colder now, as if it had been sucked from the space around me, and the silence seemed heavier than it ever had before. I quickly folded the note back up and shoved it into my pocket, my mind racing. Was this some kind of prank? But who would do this? Who would go through the trouble of writing such a note, with no explanation, no context? I didn't have any enemies, not that I knew of, anyway. But then again, how could I be sure? Could someone from my past have found me? A feeling of dread washed over me as I tried to force the thought from my mind, but it lingered there, gnawing at me. What did this person know about me? How much had they seen? The feeling of being watched only grew stronger, and no matter where I went or what I did, I couldn't shake it. It was like invisible eyes were constantly following my every move. That night, I stayed up late, unable to sleep, my thoughts swirling with panic. Every little sound sent me jumping. The creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the wind outside, all of it felt like someone was just beyond my sight, creeping closer. I kept checking the windows, the doors, making sure everything was locked. But the paranoia was unrelenting. I felt trapped, like a caged animal, with no way to escape this suffocating uncertainty. The next day, I tried to push the unease away. I went through my usual routine, but no matter where I went, I felt that same, ever-present sensation that someone was there, just out of view. Every glance over my shoulder, every shadow that flickered at the corner of my vision, everything seemed to be a reminder that someone knew things they shouldn't. Then, a few days later, I found another note. This time, it was slipped under the door, and I hadn't heard a thing. No footsteps, no car pulling up, no sound of a person at all. Yet there it was, another small, folded piece of paper. My gut churned as I hesitated. I didn't want to open it, but something pulled me in, a morbid curiosity mixed with a heavy sense of dread. I unfolded it slowly, my hands trembling. This one was even more specific than the first. The words on the paper sent a shiver down my spine. I know where you work. I know your family. I know everything about you. I dropped the note, my blood turning to ice in my veins. How could someone know all of this? I'd been so careful, so private. I kept to myself, I kept my life guarded. But now, it felt like all of that was for nothing. Whoever this person was, they knew me. They knew things no stranger could possibly know. The fear began to spiral, consuming me. Every person I saw seemed like a potential threat. Every car that passed by felt like it might stop at my house. I was on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling hunted. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that there was nowhere to hide. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to act. I went through the house, checking every window, every door, every corner. I even checked the attic, the basement, every hidden space where someone could be hiding. The house felt colder than usual, as if the shadows were pressing in from all sides. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was still watching me, waiting. Days turned into weeks, and the notes kept coming. Each one more detailed, more disturbing than the last. They knew where I went, who I spoke to, what I did in my spare time. I couldn't figure out how they were doing it. Was I being followed? Had someone infiltrated my life so thoroughly that they knew my every move? Was there someone living in the walls of my house, silently watching me? I stopped going out. I stopped answering my phone. I stopped checking my emails. I thought if I isolated myself long enough, maybe they'd lose interest. But the notes kept coming. Each one was more personal, more unsettling. And then one day, I found something new. I was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the coffee table when I noticed it, something small, just barely visible in the dim light. A key. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It was old-fashioned, simple, but as I looked closer, I saw a note attached to it. Come find me. The handwriting was the same. And in that moment, I realized that this was no longer just a game. The person who had been watching me wasn't done yet. They were just getting started. Story 8. It was one of those quiet, lonely nights when I had finally settled onto the couch, sinking into the cushions after a long, exhausting day. The house was still, the only sound the occasional creak of the floorboards, the walls sighing with age. I was alone, my family out for the evening, leaving me with nothing but the silence to keep me company. I didn't mind it. In fact, I relished it. The peace of the old house was oddly comforting, like a constant, steady heartbeat in a chaotic world. The creaks and groans. Just the house being itself. Or so I told myself. But then the lights began to flicker. At first, it was barely noticeable, a brief, almost imperceptible flicker in the kitchen light. I glanced up, assuming it was just a bulb acting up. Nothing to worry about. But then it happened again, and this time, the flicker lasted longer. There was a faint buzzing sound, like the light was straining to stay on, and for a brief moment, I found myself frowning, uneasy. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen, thinking it was just a loose bulb or some electrical issue. As soon as I stepped into the kitchen, the light went completely dark. I froze, staring at the fixture above me. It wasn't the bulb, that much was clear. I flicked the switch on and off, but nothing happened. A heavy silence settled over me, thick and unnerving, as I turned to leave. That's when it happened. The light suddenly flared back to life, but it wasn't like before, it was flashing rapidly, flickering wildly, almost as if it had a mind of its own. A chill ran down my spine. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen in the doorway. The flickering was no longer just a malfunction, it felt like something else. Something deliberate. But I shrugged it off, dismissing it as an old wiring issue. It was nothing. Probably. I tried to ignore the feeling creeping up my spine, but it was impossible. The living room light began flickering, too. Subtle at first, just like the kitchen, but then it grew more frequent, the light dimming and brightening, as if it were struggling, fighting to stay alive. I turned the switch off, hoping to stop whatever was happening, but when I flipped it back on, the light didn't respond right away. For a moment, it stayed dark, and I thought maybe it had just died. But then, without warning, it burst to life, much brighter than before, the room suddenly illuminated in an unnatural glow. My heart began to race. I moved to the lamp beside the couch, flipping it on in an attempt to regain some control over the situation, but the moment I did, it too began to flicker. It was as if the entire house had suddenly come alive, pulsing with an eerie electrical hum. The lights buzzed louder, almost deafening, and that's when the sensation hit me, the feeling of being watched. At first, it was subtle, a quiet voice at the back of my mind, but soon, it grew impossible to ignore. The air felt colder, heavier, as though something unseen had entered the room with me. I grabbed my phone, intending to call someone, but when I lifted it to my ear, I saw the battery icon flash, empty. It had been fully charged just moments before. Panic set in as I fumbled to plug it into the charger, but when I looked up, the lights in the hallway had started flickering, too. This wasn't just a malfunction anymore. It felt intentional. My breath caught in my throat as I realized something strange, unnerving. The lights were flickering in a pattern, almost like a code. It was as if they were trying to communicate, but with who? Or with what? I rushed through the house, checking every bulb, every switch, searching for a logical explanation. But nothing made sense. The lights continued to flicker violently, and the hum of electricity in the walls grew louder, like an incessant pulse under the floorboards. My mind raced, trying to convince itself that this was just a power surge, a fault in the wiring, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It felt too deliberate. Too wrong. And then, suddenly, the lights stopped altogether. The house was plunged into darkness. I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest, the silence oppressive and thick. It wasn't the kind of silence you expect when the lights go out, it was the kind of silence that presses in on you, suffocating you. The air felt heavier, like it was waiting. And then, I felt it again, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a presence, something close, just out of sight, waiting for me to make a move. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking as I tried to use the flashlight. But before I could turn it on, I heard something, a whisper. Soft at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. I froze, holding my breath. It came again, louder this time, but still faint, still almost imperceptible. The voice, soft but icy, sent a chill straight through me. You shouldn't be here. I tried to speak, to ask who it was, but no words came out. My mouth felt sealed shut, as though the very act of trying to respond was being smothered. The whisper continued, but now it was different, lower, guttural, as if the voice had no intention of stopping. It wasn't just speaking anymore. It was commanding. You can't leave. The lights flickered back on, blindingly bright, all at once. The sudden light made my eyes burn, and as I squinted to adjust, I saw something in the corner of the room. A shadow. It was tall, featureless, standing just outside the reach of the light. It was watching me. Fear gripped my heart. My legs turned to jelly, my knees buckling beneath me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't run. I was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer terror that came with knowing that whatever this thing was, it didn't belong in this world. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the shadow, until I was at the door. The lights flickered again, and then, just as the shadow moved, the whisper grew louder, more insistent. Stay. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed for me to run, and that's exactly what I did. I bolted for the door, throwing it open, and the cool night air rushed in. I didn't stop running until I was at the neighbor's house, my hands trembling uncontrollably as I pounded on their door. When they answered, they didn't ask questions. They saw the fear in my eyes and let me in without a word. The next morning, I returned to my house, the neighbor in tow, hoping it was all just some awful nightmare. But when I stepped inside, everything seemed perfectly normal. The lights were working fine, the house quiet. There was no sign of the shadow, no trace of the whispering. But I knew better. That fear still lingered in my chest, heavy and suffocating. I had the distinct, terrible feeling that whatever happened that night hadn't finished with me. It wasn't just a malfunction. It wasn't just an old house and faulty wiring. No. It was something else, something that had been waiting. And deep down, I could feel it, waiting for the right moment. Waiting to come back. Story 9. I woke up to the unsettling buzz of my phone, the kind of wake-up call that felt wrong from the start. The screen lit up with a strange, cryptic message, "I'm waiting for you to wake up." My heart skipped a beat, frozen for a moment as I stared at the words, the hairs on the back of my neck standing tall. It wasn't from anyone I knew. No name, no number, just that chilling line. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the fog of sleep, but the words refused to leave my mind. They echoed in my head, spinning in circles. I glanced around the room, half expecting something, anything, to seem out of place. But the room was quiet, still. The only sound was the tick-tick-tick of the clock on the wall, a soft but maddening reminder of the normalcy that should have been. Everything was just as it should be, or so I thought. But the message clung to me, like a whisper brushing against my ear. I opened the text, searching for some clue, some explanation, but there was nothing. No sender's name, no phone number, just that unnerving message. "I'm waiting for you to wake up." The words seemed oddly personal, like the sender knew exactly what time I had just woken up, like they had been standing there, waiting for the precise moment I would stir from sleep. My mind raced. Could I have gotten this while I was asleep? But who would send such a thing? No one had my number like that, no one knew when I woke up, or at least, no one should have. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin, the air suddenly thick, like something was pressing down on me. I checked my phone's notifications again, desperate for some explanation, but there was nothing. No missed calls. No new messages. Only the one. The phone seemed to freeze for a moment, like the screen was hesitating, reluctant to let me read any further. But there was no stopping me. I scrolled back to the message again, searching for some hidden meaning, anything that could explain it. There was nothing. Just that same line, "I'm waiting for you to wake up." A chill ran down my spine. The minutes dragged on, stretching unnaturally, and I could feel something in the room change. The quiet was deafening. Every creak of the floor, every tick of the clock, sounded too loud. I stood up shakily, my legs unsteady beneath me, and walked to the window. The world outside was eerily still. No birds, no distant car hums, nothing. It was like the neighborhood was holding its breath, frozen in time. I pulled the curtains shut, trying to force the unsettling thought out of my mind, but the message refused to let me go. It clung to me, replaying itself in my head over and over. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but who could I trust with something so strange? It felt like I was trapped in some twisted dream, and the more I thought about it, the more disconnected from reality I felt. I glanced at the message one last time, my fingers trembling as I held the phone. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. And then, just as I thought I might have imagined it all, the phone buzzed again. My heart stopped. I froze. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I unlocked the phone with shaking hands. A new message had arrived. You should have been here earlier. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. What did that mean? I looked around the room, my eyes darting nervously from corner to corner, a growing sense of dread tightening in my chest. Something was watching me. I could feel it, lurking just beyond my line of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but who would believe me? How could I explain something so bizarre without sounding insane? I needed to know where these messages had come from. I scrolled through my texts, searching frantically for any sign of where the messages had come from, but there was nothing. No one I knew had texted me. The number was unfamiliar. I tried calling it, but the call wouldn't connect, as if the number didn't even exist. Panic gripped me as I tried again, but the result was the same. It was like I was being toyed with, forced to confront something I couldn't understand. And then it hit me. The messages weren't just random. They were a countdown. The first one had come the exact moment I woke up. And now, the second, you should have been here earlier, suggested something had already happened. A terrible thought crept into my mind. What if the message wasn't meant for me to wake up? What if it was meant for me to stay asleep? I rushed to the door, tearing it open, hoping to find some sign of normality. But outside, everything was eerily quiet. The world felt suspended in time. The house was silent. The usual hum of life had vanished, leaving nothing but a heavy stillness that pressed against my chest. I made my way down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house was dead silent, the only sound the soft creak of the floor beneath my feet. As I entered the living room, my eyes landed on the coffee table, and my blood turned to ice. There, on the table, lay a third message, not on my phone this time, but written in messy, spidery handwriting, scrawled across a piece of paper. It read, "I told you I was waiting." I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The handwriting matched the message from my phone. But I hadn't written it. I hadn't seen anyone in the house. My hands shook violently as I picked up the paper. The ink was still fresh, still wet, as if the words had been written moments ago. Whoever had sent those messages had been in my house. They had been waiting for me to wake up. My mind spiraled. Maybe this was a cruel prank, some elaborate joke. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. This wasn't a joke. This was something else. Something much worse. I looked around the room, the walls closing in on me. The air grew colder, heavier, and I could feel something shifting, something moving just beyond my reach. The door was right there, but as my hand grasped the handle, the lights flickered. The air grew icy, and a soft whisper brushed against my ear. "I've been waiting." I whipped around, but the room was empty, just as it had been before. Yet, the presence lingered, thick in the air. It was as if someone, or something, was standing right behind me, watching, waiting. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating me, and I knew without a doubt that whatever was waiting for me, it knew I had finally woken up. Story 10. I had just returned home after a grueling day at work. The exhaustion felt like a heavy weight on my shoulders, each step toward the door feeling like an effort. Kicking off my shoes, I tossed my bag by the entrance, but something about the house felt different, empty in a way that made the air heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The quiet was deafening. It was a silence I couldn't shake. I wandered through the hallway, my fingers grazing the familiar, worn frame of a family photo hanging on the wall. It was a routine I never thought twice about, until I reached the living room. That's when I saw it. On the coffee table, an unfamiliar photo stared back at me. It wasn't a family photo. It wasn't even one I recognized. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the picture in disbelief. There I was, unmistakably me, standing in front of a building I had never seen before. The architecture was strange, foreign. The streets around it were eerily empty, a ghostly quietness lingering in the air. But the most unsettling part wasn't the location, it was the person standing beside me. A stranger. Someone I didn't know, and yet they were there, standing next to me as if we had always belonged together in that moment. I stood frozen, staring at the photo, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. How could this be? How could I have no memory of being in this place, standing beside this person? I was certain it was me. The face was mine. The expression on my face, it was mine, but everything else, everything about the situation, felt like it had been pulled from someone else's nightmare. I picked the photo up, my hands trembling as I turned it over, desperate for some explanation. But there was nothing. No date, no words, no clue as to who had taken it, or why. Just a cold emptiness that seemed to seep into the room. I glanced around the living room, hoping to find something that would offer even the faintest shred of comfort, something that could make sense of this mystery. But nothing had changed. The furniture was in its usual place, the same decorations, the same warm rug on the floor. Everything was exactly how I had left it. Except the photo. That photo, an anomaly that didn't belong, like a wound on an otherwise perfect body. My fingers were still trembling as I set the photo back on the table, trying to steady my racing thoughts. Maybe it was a prank, I told myself. Maybe I had blocked out a memory, and this was some kind of strange joke. But deep down, a gnawing sense of dread told me it wasn't a joke. It couldn't be. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call someone, anyone, who could help me make sense of it. Maybe a friend, someone who would laugh it off and tell me I was just tired. But when I unlocked the screen, I froze. My phone was filled with messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Short, cryptic messages that only added to the unsettling feeling growing in my chest. Some messages were just random strings of words, nonsensical at first glance. Others made chilling references to places and events I couldn't remember. One simply read, "We were there. Remember?" Another said, "It's happening again." My stomach twisted into knots as I scrolled through them, my mind desperate to connect the dots, to figure out what was happening, but each message only deepened the confusion, the sense that something terrible was unfolding just out of reach. And then my phone buzzed again. A new message, from an unknown number. My heart pounded as I hesitated before opening it. When I did, the message was simple, yet sent a cold shiver through my spine. "I'm waiting for you." The clock on the wall read almost midnight. I stared at the message, my mind racing. Who was waiting for me? The person in the photo? The stranger who seemed so familiar, and yet, so distant? I felt an icy chill creep up my spine. There was something about the person in that photo that haunted me, like they were watching me, waiting for me to figure it out. But how? I turned back to the photo, studying it once more, desperate for some sort of clue, some thread that would pull me out of this madness. The longer I stared, the more the building in the background seemed to shift. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but then I saw it, a strange pulsating, like the building was alive. And the worst part? The more I looked at the photo, the less it seemed to be me. It was me, but it wasn't. The way I stood, the look in my eyes, they weren't mine. It was as though the version of me in that photo was someone else entirely. A noise from the hallway snapped me out of my daze. My heart leapt in my chest as I whipped my head toward the sound. There was no one there. Just the faint creaking of floorboards in the distance. My breath quickened as a wave of nausea hit me. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I had to get out of this house, this room, this place where everything felt wrong. I grabbed my coat and keys, but as I reached for the door, my phone buzzed once more. Another message. I glanced at the screen, and my blood turned cold. Don't go. My hand froze in midair, hovering over the door handle. The words echoed in my mind, over and over, sending chills down my spine. Who was this person? Why were they doing this? The walls of the room seemed to close in around me, suffocating me with a sense of impending doom. I couldn't stay here, but I couldn't leave either. I was trapped. I glanced back at the photo, my mind reeling with the questions I couldn't answer. The stranger in the photo, the eerie place, the cryptic messages. All of it felt like a waking nightmare. But it was more than that. It was real. It was happening, and I didn't know how to stop it. The more I stared at the photo, the more it seemed to mock me, like it was daring me to remember. And for the first time, I realized the true horror. It wasn't the photo or the messages. It was the slow, creeping terror that maybe, just maybe, the scariest thing of all wasn't what I had forgotten, but the fact that I might never remember.